Japanese Admiral inspected captured B-29 wreckage and realized Japan had already lost. A bold statement. But in the winter of 1944, on the windswept coastline of Kyushu, it was not a slogan. It was a moment of quiet, devastating truth. On December 7, 1944, near Omura Bay, a small team of Japanese naval engineers gathered around the broken remains of an American B-29 superfortress shot down the previous night during a high-altitude bombing raid on the industrial port of Nagasaki. The aircraft, designated B-29-15B, serial number 426-3456, lay in several large sections scattered across the muddy field. Its four massive Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone engines were twisted but identifiable. Fragments of the once pressurized fuselage gleamed under the gray morning light. When Admiral Soemud Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, arrived later that day, officers expected a routine inspection. Another downed enemy bomber, another airframe to analyze. But as Toyoda stepped through the wreckage, running his hands over torn hydraulic lines, shattered plexiglass, and remote-controlled gun turrets, something tightened in his chest. What he saw here was not simply the debris of an enemy aircraft. It was proof that the war Japan had launched in 1941 had already slipped beyond its reach. Within hours, he would make a stunning private conclusion, one that few Japanese leaders dared admit aloud. Japan was fighting a nation with technology 10 years ahead, and industrial capacity a century ahead. This is the story of the moment Admiral Toyoda realized Japan had already lost the Pacific War. To understand why the wreckage of one American bomber carried such significance, we must step back to the strategic situation facing Japan in late 1944. By autumn of that year, the empire's military fortunes were collapsing on every front. Saipan had fallen in July, placing American B-29 bases within striking distance of the Japanese home islands for the first time. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October had shattered the remaining Japanese naval power. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized ships. American industrial output, over 90,000 aircraft produced in 1944, alone dwarfed anything Japan could hope to match. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces had long expected the B-29 to appear over the mainland. American newspapers openly discussed the bomber in 1943, calling it the world's most advanced aircraft. Japanese intelligence made similar assessments, identifying it as a super-heavy aircraft with unprecedented range and altitude. But knowing of its existence was different from confronting its reality. The first B-29 raids on Japan in November 1944 demonstrated its terrifying capabilities, flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, beyond the comfortable reach of most Japanese fighters. The superfortresses dropped bombs with accuracy that stunned observers. Even when the bombs missed, civilian morale trembled at the knowledge that no city, no matter how far north or south, was safe. The Japanese Army Air Force managed occasional successes. On December 6th, anti-aircraft gunners near Nagasaki succeeded in scoring several hits on a B-29 returning to Saipan. Engines sputtering, the bomber descended rapidly, attempting an emergency landing before crashing near Omura Bay. It was a small victory, but it was also an opportunity. When word reached Imperial Navy headquarters, Admiral Toyoda ordered a personal inspection of the wreck. A man known for clear-eyed realism, he refused to rely solely on reports. He wanted to see the truth of the American bomber with his own eyes. Accompanying him that day were Captain Mitsuo Matsuda, head of Naval Technical Command, Lieutenant Commander Kiyoshi Hirano, an engineer specializing in aircraft and several technicians from the Yokozuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal. Toyoda respected these men, but he also knew that their industrial base, already strangled by shortages, could not create miracles. What they discovered in that muddy field would confirm his fears. Little did they know, what happened next would become legendary among those who witnessed it. Toyoda began at the tail section, where the B-29's most remarkable defensive innovation caught his attention: the General Electric Central Fire Control System. Though heavily damaged, its control cables and electric servos were still recognizable. Hirano knelt beside a shattered turret mount. It's all remote controlled, he whispered. Toyoda frowned. Explain. Hirano pointed to the wiring bundles. The gunner does not sit in these turrets, Admiral. They operate them from inside the fuselage using analog computers. Computers. Toyoda repeated. The word sounded foreign, even to him. A junior engineer added nervously. 4 turrets, each capable of coordinated fire. They can track a target and calculate lead. Automatically, Toyoda remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, our fighters struggled to reach 30,000 feet. How are they expected to approach a machine that can defend itself more intelligently than its own crew? By 1400 hours, the inspection team moved toward the forward fuselage. The crushed compartment gave way to a torn cross-section of aluminum alloy. But even ruined, it revealed something that stunned Japanese engineers. A fully pressurized crew cabin. Until that moment, neither the Army nor Navy possessed anything comparable. Their high-altitude efforts relied on oxygen masks and thick flight suits. Hirano shook his head. This level of pressurization, Admiral, this is years beyond our capability. The cabin windows, though shattered, were made of layered plexiglass, stronger than anything in Japanese production. Electrical heating elements were embedded between the layers. Toyoda stood inside the wreckage and looked around. Here was a bomber that let its crew fly thousands of miles, warm, protected, and able to breathe as if sitting in a room on the ground. This is not just an airplane, Toyoda murmured. It is an entire system. His words were carried away by the cold December wind. Next, the group examined the engines for massive Wright R3350 duplicyclones, each capable of producing 2,200 horsepower. Their superchargers, though warped by impact, were clearly far more advanced than anything Japan possessed. The Japanese Army's experimental attempts at turbo-supercharging had never overcome metal fatigue and heat tolerance failures. Hirano ran a hand across the broken compressor blades. We could not build this, even if we had the materials, he admitted. Not in 5 years. Toyoda did not need reminding that Japan no longer had 5 months. And then came the final blow. Near the cockpit lay a steel case, battered but recognizable. Inside was a single, cracked optical assembly, the Norden bomb sight. It was unlike anything any Japanese manufacturer had ever produced. Toyoda lifted it gently. This is their accuracy, a technician explained quietly. Admiral, this one device might take 5 or more years for Japan to replicate. Toyoda nodded. He knew the truth. Japan had entered a war it could not technologically sustain. Toyoda had seen enough machines in his lifetime to understand when he stood before a generational leap in technology. But knowing it and accepting its consequences were 2 different things. He straightened slowly, passing the cracked Norden bomb sight back to the technician as a gust of cold December air swept through the broken fuselage. For a moment, none of the men spoke. The crash site lay eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of trucks on the coastal road. Then Captain Matsudra finally broke the silence. Admiral, if the Americans can field these in large numbers. Toyoda stopped him with a look. They already are. It was the truth. Us factories were turning out B-29s at a pace Japan could never match. Every month, dozens more took to the skies from bases in the Maritime. Even in their earliest missions, despite engine failures, navigation difficulties, and crews still gaining superfortresses were already proving impossible to stop. Toyoda stepped out of the fuselage and traced the bomber's long silhouette. In the mud, with his eyes, imagining it whole. He pictured the American crew inside 11 men, breathing comfortably at altitude, using a bomb sight more sophisticated than anything his country could design, protected by a system that used analog computing to target fighters. Before the pilots even got within range, he exhaled. And this was one aircraft, he said quietly. One failure. He gestured toward the empty sky over Nagasaki. Imagine 500. By 14:30 hours, the inspection team moved to the wings, where the fuel systems were partially intact. The B-29's design used self-sealing tanks and an advanced distribution layout that allowed fuel transfer to maintain. Center of gravity balance and other innovation far beyond Japanese capability. A junior engineer pointed to the charred remains of the tanks. "These bladders," he said, "they conceal small caliber hits. We have nothing like it." Toyota sighed, and American gunners are trained to fire thousands of rounds to protect them. They expect the enemy to hit them. It was a subtle, chilling point. American designers assumed battle damage and engineered solutions. Japanese designers assumed perfection and prayed for it. Matsuda turned to Toyota, his voice low. "Our fighters are Ki-43s. Our A6M50s cannot climb to match these altitudes with full combat loads. Even when they do, they cannot stay there. And even if they could, Admiral, even then they must face 4 turrets with tracking computers." Toyota closed his eyes. It was the math of defeat. By 1500 hours, the winter sun had begun to sink, casting long shadows across the crash site. Toyota requested that the team gather their findings and walk with him to the final piece of the wreckage, the nose assembly. It was here that the bomber's advanced avionics and internal systems were most evident. The twisted remains of the radio compartment still held fragments of an advanced NAP-Q-13 bombing. Radar its waveguide channels, bent but identifiable. Hirono examined it and shook his head in disbelief. "Admiral, they can bomb through clouds. They can bomb at night. They can bomb when our searchlights cannot see them." Toyota looked toward the darkening sky, and this is only the beginning. By next year, they will perfect this technology. There was one more piece to inspect, the cockpit structure. Even smashed and burned, it revealed engineering that made the Japanese officers uneasy. The layout was spacious, ergonomic, and designed for long-range precision. Every dial, every instrument, every switch had a purpose. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Services had always emphasized pilot skill over machine sophistication, but the Americans' their philosophy was clear. Build machines so advanced that even an average pilot becomes exceptional. Toyota stepped inside the broken cockpit, resting a hand on the pilot's shattered control yoke. He whispered to himself, "We have been surpassed." The engineers looked at him, but none spoke, because each man standing there on that cold Kyushu shoreline felt something they had not felt since the early days of the war. Fear, not fear of American aircraft, not fear of American bombs, but fear of an enemy industrial machine so powerful that no Japanese countermeasure could hope to keep pace. By 15:30 hours, as the wind grew sharper and the sun dipped lower, Toyota ordered all men to assemble for an immediate debrief on site. They formed a semicircle beside the wreckage. Toyota stood before them, hands clasped behind his back. "This aircraft," he said, voice steady, "is a weapon of a nation that understands the future." He gestured toward the crushed engines and electronics. "We have fought bravely. Our pilots, our sailors, our soldiers, they have given everything. But bravery cannot lift us to 30,000 feet. Courage cannot turn steel into computers. Spirit cannot replace factories." The men stared at the ground. Toyota continued, "You must understand what this means. Not for today's battle. Not for tomorrow's raid. But for the war itself." He waited. "We cannot stop this." Captain Matsuda swallowed hard. "Then what are we to do, Admiral?" Toyota looked at the horizon where smoke from burning oil tanks still rose from the previous night's raid. "We will fight," he said, "because we have no choice, but you will prepare for what comes next." His voice softened. "And you will remember this day. Because future historians will say that when Japan first inspected a B-29, the war's outcome was already decided." The men were silent. The only sound was the cold wind rattling through the broken alloy skin of the bomber. In the days immediately after Toyota's inspection, Japan experienced the full force of what he had feared. On December 13, 1944, just 6 days after the Nagasaki raid, the US-21 Bomber Command launched its largest attack yet. Dozens of B-29s lifted off from Saipan and Tinian, climbing into the thin, frigid air above 30,000 feet. Their objective, the Mitsubishi Aircraft Engine Plant in Nagoya, one of the last major industrial sites producing components for the Japanese war machine. Japanese radar stations detected the incoming strike at 1,000 hours. Fighters scrambled from airfields across Honshu Ki-44 Tojos Ki-61 Tonys and a handful of A-6M50s. But as they climbed into the sky, pilots felt the same sense of dread that had seeped through Toyota's inspection team. At 28,000 feet, engines strained. At 30,000 feet, controls stiffened. At 31,000 feet, several aircraft simply fell away, unable to maintain altitude. Meanwhile, the B-29 formation cruised comfortably above them, engines humming, cabins pressurized, crews warm and composed. What happened next would confirm the very nightmare Toyota had predicted at the crash site. As the B-29s approached Nagoya, the sky grew thick with contrails' white scars stretching across the deep blue. The formation held steady at 31,500 feet, just above the ceiling where Japanese fighters could maneuver effectively. Inside each superfortress, bombardiers adjusted their Norden bomb sights, while navigators monitored the AN-APQ-13 radar, bouncing signals off the city below. At 10:35 hours, the first wave of Japanese fighters clawed their way into visual contact. Ki-44s, among the only fighters capable of climbing this high, struggled to maintain both altitude and speed. Pilots later described the experience as flying on the edge of a stall. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka of the 47th Sentai radioed his wingman, "I cannot close the distance. They are too fast." Another pilot shouted, "The turrets are tracking Mihao." And then the B-29s opened fire. What unfolded over Nagoya became one of the most lopsided air battles of the entire Pacific War. The remote-controlled turret stew on top, two below, plus the tail mount locked onto targets using the central fire control system. Even when the gunners could barely see the Japanese fighters through the oxygen-frosted windows, the analog computers compensated, calculating range, speed, and lead angle with astonishing accuracy. Tracer fire lanced across the sky. A Ki-44 burst into flames. Moments later, a Ki-61 spiraled downward, its wings sheared off. The Japanese pilots had never faced anything like it. For 3 brutal hours, the battle raged. Japanese interceptors launched repeated attacks. But each attempt ended the same way: approach, be detected, come under coordinated turret fire, and break off or be destroyed. Some pilots tried climbing above the formation to dive down, but their engines, starved of oxygen, sputtered out. Meanwhile, the B-29s continued on course, unwavering. At 11:05 hours, the first bombs fell on Nagoya. The Mitsubishi engine plant, already strained by reduced steel and aluminum supplies, could not afford even a temporary shutdown. But the combination of clear skies and radar guidance made the strike devastatingly precise. Buildings erupted in orange fireballs. The ground shook. Entire assembly lines vanished under collapsing roofs. Inside a command shelter, 2 miles away, engineers watched helplessly as the shock waves rattled their windows. By 11:30 hours, the American formation turned south, engines roaring like distant thunder as they climbed away from the burning city. Only 7 Japanese aircraft remained in the air battered, fuel depleted, and unable to pursue. News of the Nagoya strike reached Tokyo within minutes. Messages poured into Navy headquarters, overwhelming losses. Enemy altitude unreachable, defenses ineffective. Admiral Toyoda sat at his desk, staring at the casualty report. He did not feel surprise. He felt confirmation. This was the crisis made. Manifest Japan's defense networks, collapsing under the weight of American industry and American innovation. B-29s were no longer distant threats. They were overhead, unstoppable, erasing the empire's ability to wage war. And worse was coming. After the December 13th raid, Toyoda met privately with senior naval staff at the underground bunker beneath the Naval General Staff Building in Tokyo. The dim light flickered against concrete walls as he spread reconnaissance photos of Nagoya across a long table. Factories reduced to rubble, rail lines severed, smoke rising for miles. Toyoda tapped a finger on the photographs. This is the result of a single day's attack. What happens when they send 200 aircraft, 300? A young officer replied bitterly, "Our fighters will meet them." Toyoda fixed him with a calm, piercing gaze. "No, they will not. They cannot. You were at Omura, Bayou, saw the wreckage. You saw their machines. Tell me honestly, how do we stop such a weapon?" The officer lowered his eyes. "We cannot, sir." Toyoda leaned back, exhaustion etched into his face. "This is the crisis, not the loss of Nagoya, or Saipan, or the fleet. It is the realization that we are fighting an enemy whose technological ability places them beyond our reach." He paused. "And the B-29 is only the beginning." What none of them knew, what not even Toyoda yet realized, was that the Americans were already preparing to replace high-altitude precision bombing with something far deadlier: incendiary raids that would turn entire cities into firestorms. But that turning point would come soon, and Toyoda would witness that revelation as well. The shock of the December raids forced Japan to confront its growing desperation. Engineers poured over the B-29 wreckage from Omura Bay. But the results were bleak. Reports concluded: turbo supercharging beyond current capability, pressurized cabins impossible with available alloys, remote turret computing, far beyond Japanese electrical industry engines, requiring precision machines Japan no longer possessed. One report ended with a haunting line: "We can study these systems, but we cannot reproduce them." Toyoda knew the truth. Japan was losing not only the skies, but the war's future. Then, in February 1945, everything changed. On February 4th, General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command. He arrived with a simple, brutal philosophy. High-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. Weather winds and mechanical problems limited effectiveness. It was time for a new approach: low-altitude, nighttime incendiary attacks. Toyoda received the intelligence briefing 2 weeks later. He read the translation twice, his heart sinking. A single B-29 carried up to 7 tons of incendiaries. A raid of 250 aircraft meant nearly 1,800 tons of firebombs. Japanese cities built of wood and paper were defenseless against such weapons. On March 9, 1945, the prediction became reality. Toyoda was at naval headquarters when reports began streaming in. Radar tracked hundreds of aircraft approaching from the southeast. Tokyo's air defenses scrambled. But the B-29s came in low-so-low radar, barely registered them. At 0020 hours, the first bombs fell. M69 incendiaries that exploded and sprayed flaming jelly into homes, factories, and entire neighborhoods. The fire spread faster than any previous raid. Within 30 minutes, the city was engulfed. Winds turned the flames into tornadoes. Civilians fled toward the Sumida River, only to find the bridges burning. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. In just 3 hours, over 100,000 civilians were dead. Tokyo burned like a furnace. Toyoda stood in the operations room, listening to reports of neighborhoods erased, districts destroyed, emergency stations collapsing. Names of units faded as radio operators suffocated in smoke. He closed his eyes. The image of the wrecked B-29 at Omura flashed in his mind: its pressurized cabin, its advanced radar, its Norden bomb site. And he realized that what he had feared in December had come to pass. The B-29 was no longer a symbol of American superiority. It was the instrument of Japan's destruction. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Toyoda whispered, barely audible, "This is the turning point. The war is already lost." But even in this moment of despair, something else began to take shape. An understanding of why Japan had been overcome and what lesson history must learn from it. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945 was only the beginning. Over the next several weeks, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army watched helplessly as the B-29s shifted tactics entirely. The new doctrine was simple: burn every city that supports the war effort. Burn every factory. Burn every port. Burn every source of resistance. On March 11th, Nagoya was hit again. On March 13th, Osaka. On March 16th, Kobe. Each attack followed the same pattern: low-level approach, few losses, maximum destruction. Japanese fire brigades, already ravaged by previous raids, had no chance. Water mains ruptured, streets choked with debris. Entire districts vanished, in infernos reaching 1,000 degrees Celsius. Admiral Toyoda received hourly reports. By late March, the devastation was so vast that the Imperial Navy's own logistical centers struggled to track the status of supply depots and transport hubs. Everything was either burned, burning, or none. Yet the B-29s kept coming, and their numbers kept growing. By April 1945, American industry had delivered more than 900 B-29s, with hundreds more in reserve. Japan's once feared fighter force was now a shadow, crippled by fuel shortages and lack of spare parts. Factories that had produced engines, propellers, and airframes were now rubble. Toyoda's realization in December that Japan could not match. American technology had expanded into something far more devastating. Japan could no longer match anything. Not planes, not engines, not ammunition, not even basic building materials. Technology was no longer a gap. It was a chasm. The B-29 had become the symbol of that truth. In the aftermath of the firebombing campaigns, historians would count the cost. 67 Japanese cities attacked. Over 300,000 civilians killed. Millions left homeless. Industrial capacity reduced by more than 50%. But numbers alone cannot convey the scale of collapse Admiral Toyoda witnessed. In May 1945, he was invited to inspect several more wrecked B-29s, one on Honshu and two on Kyushu. But the Admiral declined. He did not need to see more wreckage. He had already learned what mattered at Omura Bay. Japan had lost, not because its soldiers lacked bravery, nor because its sailors lacked discipline, nor because its pilots lacked courage. It lost because it had entered a modern industrial war without the means to fight one. Toyoda's secret assessment shared only with a few senior officers concluded: 1. Japan's industrial base was inadequate the moment the war began. To the B-29 represented a level of engineering Japan could not hope to match. 3. The United States had mastered long-range warfare in ways Japan could not counter. For victory was impossible as early as 1944. None of this could be spoken publicly. To do so would have been treason. But Toyoda held the truth quietly, carrying it with the solemnity of a commander watching the final unraveling of the empire he had sworn to defend. By August 1945, as Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned under atomic fire, Toyoda faced the ultimate confirmation of his December realization. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. The empire was defeated. The war was over. In the years that followed, Toyoda lived quietly, cooperating with historians and post-war scholars. When asked privately by an American analyst in 1948 when he first understood Japan could not win the war, he answered, "When I saw the first B-29, he did not mean the first one in the sky. He meant the shattered bomber at Omura Bay, the one whose broken superchargers were more advanced than anything Japan could build. The one whose pressurized cabin represented a leap the empire could not reproduce. The one whose remote-controlled turrets used computing principles half the Japanese engineering world had never seen. The one whose Norden bombsight was more sophisticated than the best Japanese factories could manufacture by 1950. That wreck told the story of the war. Toyoda realized Japan had been defeated not by a single aircraft, but by what the aircraft represented. The overwhelming power of a modern industrial democracy mobilized for total war. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a symbol of a world Japan could not enter. a world built on scientific innovation, mass production, and a level of economic strength that dwarfed anything the empire could conceive. For Toyota, the legacy of that moment was simple. When a nation chooses war, it must first understand the war it is choosing. Japan had not, and it paid the price. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Hub as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.